Hello everyone, welcome to the MiningMatch. Today we have a special event. We are going to interview our golden guest, Mr. Christopher Lattanzi, mining engineer from Toronto. So we welcome Mr. Lattanzi. Hello sir, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you, Alan. Thank you for this interview.
And thank you very much for accepting and joining us in sharing a little bit of your professional life with us. I must say that you have a remarkable plus 60 years of experience. So, like every story, we can start from the beginning. If you can tell us where you were born and raised, Mr. Lattanzi.
I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1937 and spent my childhood, we lived in essentially a market gardening village about, at least then it was a village, about 50 kilometres to the east and a little bit north of Melbourne, where we had 4 acres, which we grew essentially all our own vegetables, all sorts of things. We had that really was my childhood, and it's a wonderful time because we had this village atmosphere and a few people around, but not many. Now I have to say the place where we lived is essentially an outer suburb of Melbourne. I visited it again a couple of years ago.
Okay. So your last name, Lattanzi, is that an Italian?
My father was Italian.
Okay.
And he and my mother met aboard a ship. My mother had graduated with a Bachelor of Music from the University of Melbourne. And
Okay.
her parents had some money and they sent her overseas to do some further study. And my father was an officer in the Italian Merchant Marine and happened to be the first officer on the ship that she sailed on. And in the end, they came back to Melbourne and they were married in 1936. But then in 1939, the Second World War broke out and Italy was on the wrong side. And my father was declared in Australia to be an enemy alien.
Oh.
And
Okay.
because of his history, although he was not in the Italian military navy, he was in the Merchant Marine. He was not allowed to go anywhere near the coast of Australia, and he had to report once a week to the local police station to make sure that he was still there. And of course, he could not get a job.
Okay.
So he ended up really spending the rest of his life just doing labor. He was just a laborer. And to his great credit, he never complained.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. If we can go into when you were growing up, when do you hear first about mining? Like how you get introduced to mining and why you start your mining career?
That's actually quite a long story.
Okay.
My schooling years started in this village where there was a 2-room school. In one room was grades 1 to 4 and 1 teacher, and in the other room was grades 4 to 8 and 1 teacher. I did grades 1 and 2 in that school, and then from grade 3 onwards through university, I was sent to essentially boarding school in Melbourne. Again, because my mother's parents had some money, it was one of the top private schools in Melbourne. And from there, once I graduated from there, I went on to the university. Now, once I got through high school, most of my grandparents' money had run out. They had spent it virtually all on educating my younger sister and myself. So in order to go to university, I applied for scholarships. I did want to be an engineer.
Okay.
But my initial thought was that I would like to be a civil engineer, and I had these dreams of designing these wonderful bridges and structures. In the end, I was offered a scholarship by the local electrical utility, the State Electricity Commission Victoria, which was a government organisation. And they offered me a scholarship in mining. That is how I became a mining engineer. And I have to say that it has been just a wonderful career that has taken me to so many different places. And I have not regretted a minute of it.
That's very, very cool. Yes. So, okay. So how was your experience when you got your first job in the coal mines in Victoria?
That was, those were the people, the State Electricity Commission, that had given me the scholarship. And in return, I was bonded to work for them for at least 4 years. And the electricity in the state of Victoria at that time was all produced from lignite, low quality coal, and
Okay.
which was mined from really a huge open pit at very high rates and very cheaply by mechanized, highly mechanized, continuous mining equipment. That's how I got to work there. I worked there, and they had a program for newly graduated engineers in which for the first year or 18 months, they circulated me around all of the various operating and planning departments for the mining operation, about 3 months in each of them. After that, I moved on essentially to more or less a shift foreman's job, and ultimately to being the mine superintendent in charge of the mining operations at 2 of the smaller open pits that we had.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I read that, and then in 1969, what brought you to Canada in 1969?
What brought me to Canada, and that was in 1965. I had then worked for 5 years, and I'd completed my required time with the Electricity Commission.
Yeah.
And my wife's family, her father was a doctor in general practice, a family doctor,
Yeah.
in a fairly well-to-do suburb of Melbourne. And his idea of working was to work like hell for 5 years and then get somebody in to take over the practice while he and his family traveled for a year overseas. So
Okay.
my wife was accustomed to travel, and she had the idea that we should go essentially on a round-the-world trip. Australia was, and still is to some degree, in an isolated corner of the world, and Australians
Yeah.
certainly travel a lot, so that was not uncommon. And what we decided was that we would go on a round-the-world trip. We would go to Canada, work perhaps for a year, then maybe the United States, parts of Africa, Europe, and so on.
Okay.
Our first stop was Canada, and we never got any further.
Okay.
We had when we got to Canada, we had 3 little children, and as they
Okay.
grew up and came upon school age, it was much more difficult to move.
Of course.
Been in Canada now for, it'll be 60 years soon, it's 55 or 56 years. And again,
Yes.
Canada has been very, very good to us.
Okay. Okay. So, and then you arrive into Alberta, is that right?
Yes, that is. And before we left Australia, I had sort of studied up on the Canadian mining industry. And that was at a time when the first open pit operation, commercial operation, mining the oil sand deposits in Fort McMurray in northern Alberta was being planned. And it was planned then to mine the oil sands, with machines called bucket wheel dredgers. I had had experience in Australia in coal mining with bucket wheel dredgers, but although smaller dredgers had been used in Canada, the very large commercial dredgers had not. So when we left Australia, I thought, well, really, these are probably the people who will offer me a job. And they did. They offered me a job, in fact, as mine superintendent, which was a very senior position in charge of the entire mining operation. And I was very young and I was very lucky because I had the right experience. So we ended up for a short time in Edmonton, and then we moved north to Fort McMurray, which the only reason Fort McMurray existed was because it was the end of the rail line north from Alberta and the start of the continuous water route down the Athabasca River through Great Slave and Great Bear Lakes to the Arctic. So it only existed as a town of about 900 people. The main job was to take cargo off rail cars and put it on barges. We were the third company, well, I should say now, with the development of the oil sands, Fort McMurray is a city of close to 100,000 people. There were 900 when we first went there, and it was pretty primitive. And we were the third company family to move in. It was, for me, although I was supposed to be in charge of the mine, it was really a learning experience. With temperatures that approached 100 degrees Fahrenheit colder than anything I'd ever seen. And operating in those conditions is something. Luckily, I was young and I learned quickly.
All right.
But that was what took us to northern Alberta, and we stayed there for a few years. Fort McMurray then was still a small town. The educational facilities, library facilities were primitive, and it came time to move on.
Okay. So I understand you had that job, nearly in 1969 when.
Yes, somewhere around 1969, we came to Toronto. Yes.
How do you met Dr. Robertson?
Well, Dr. Robertson, when we came to Toronto, I thought that what I would like to do was get into consulting practice, and there were a huge number. So I looked up in the yellow pages of what was then the phone book, mining consultants, and went around Toronto visiting them all. What I found was that everybody that interviewed me said, "Oh, you're from Australia, eh? Yeah. Okay, well, you're probably pretty good, but you're not going to stay." So I would say, "Look, I've got a wife and 3 little kids. I'll be here for quite a while." Anyway, as time went on, I met Dr. Robertson because he was one of the consultants. And in fact, he and his staff were, to me, the most impressive that I met.
Okay.
However, I got another job at the time with a company that manufactured rock crushers, jaw crushers, and rotary crushers. And I worked essentially as an applications engineer with them in Toronto for about a year. Then one night, I got a call from David Robertson saying that he had a mining engineer on his staff who was a very good mining engineer, but he couldn't write. And he had produced a report that needed serious editing. And would I take on that job in the moonlight hours? So I did that, and I essentially rewrote in simple English this report and gave it to David Robertson. He read it through and offered me a job.
All right.
So that was in 1969, and that was when I started a career in mining consulting, and I have been, at least in part, a consultant ever since.
Very nice. And so David Robertson and Associates, how big was that company?
It's only It was only, we had two offices. We had one in Toronto, which I think had about 5 people in, and one in Denver,
Okay.
Colorado, which had 3 people. It was really a small, but very well known
Yeah.
consulting firm with a good reputation, certainly in North America and also throughout the world.
Okay. Well, and then according to history, and when Dr. Robertson retired in 1988, is when you planned or took the decision to create your own consultancy firm?
Yes, when there was a short interlude between 1982 and 1988, David Robertson sold Robertson and Associates in 1982 to the accounting and auditing and consulting firm of then Curry Coopers and Library. It was not a particularly good fit. They did technical consulting, but the auditing practice ran the show. And it was very difficult for us to do consulting work for any company that Coopers and Lybrand audited. And Coopers and Lybrand was one of the top 4 accounting firms. So it was not a particularly good fit. David Robertson then retired from consulting practice in 1988.
Okay.
And with 4 other Robertson employees, they and I formed MICON International Limited, which still exists and in whose office I am now sitting.
Yeah.
Essentially, we thought as the successor to the original small Robertson firm. That was in 1988.
Okay. Yeah, and yeah, MICON, we want to talk about MICON. I mean, it has been in business for almost 35 years now. So, how was the beginning of MICON? I mean, you were the first president and founder of with your other colleagues. How was the beginning? It was challenging.
The beginning wasn't bad. You know, I did have the privilege of serving as president of MICON from founding in 1988 through about 2004 when I got a bit old. Initially, oddly, there were still people at Coopers and Lybrand who, when somebody came with a mining, and they were big auditors in the mining industry, and when they met a company that needed a consultant, they would recommend MICON because they knew us and we thought that we were competent. So we really got off to a flying start, and almost certainly our practice initially was concentrated in North America and Canada and quite largely in the United States. Gradually, however, we became approached by Canadian or US mining companies principally who had operations in other countries and needed consulting advice. That brought us to about 1990, I think it was 1994, when we established an office in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
The office, and it still exists. It was not in London or any well-known city. It was in Norwich, which is a little bit north of London. And the reason for that was where the man who we chose to run our office lived.
Okay.
The best of all reasons for choosing an office location. Through that office, we gradually developed quite an extensive practice in Europe and in the former Soviet Union.
Okay.
Particularly with the Soviet Union has different methods of classifying the resources and reserves that a mining company or exploration company might have. The amount of quantity and the grade of the mineralization that they might have. And as time went on, quite a lot of the larger companies in Russia decided that they would like to list on on Western stock exchanges, and particularly on the London Stock Exchange. In order to do that, one of the prerequisites was that what is called a competent persons report be prepared by an independent mining consultant on the assets of the company seeking to list on the stock exchange. And our office in the United Kingdom was very successful at doing a tremendous amount of that work, and they continue working in Eastern Europe to this day.
Exactly. Until this day, they serve Russia and the rest of Europe. Yes. Okay. So after, in 2005, when you retired, I mean, from the presidency of MICON, you began another phase in your career to be a director for various mining companies.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I suppose I became reasonably well known in the North American mining industry through being the president of MICON. And from about the mid-1990s onwards, I would be approached occasionally to join a board of directors. The first one that I joined, and that was in 1999, was, let me just say, it's not easy to be a director and an independent consultant, because you can run up with conflicts of interest if the company of which you're a director decides it wants to buy one of your clients.
Exactly.
That, of course, is an immense conflict, and you have to absent yourself from all of that. But I joined the board of Meridian Gold, I think it was in 1999. Meridian Gold produced gold from mines it was a Canadian company, but it was headquartered, its executive office was in Reno, Nevada, and it had mines in the United States, one in Nevada, and later on a particularly rich mine, El Peñon, in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. That was a very rich mine, and it made Meridian. As time went on, the directors changed, as directors generally are older people, and as time goes on, they retire. In the end, and this is really ultimately what precipitated me stepping down as president of MICON, was that I was appointed the chairman of the board of Meridian in 2003, and occupied that position, and that definitely would have put me in huge conflict. So it was then that I stepped down as chairman of as president of MICON, and essentially and also as an employee. And I became a retained consultant and associate of MICON, which I still am to this day.
Yes.
Ultimately, Meridian was then, I think in 2007, was acquired by another gold mining company, Yamana, so Meridian disappeared.
Okay.
In the I guess somewhere around 2010, I then became a director of a company called Argonaut Gold. Argonaut, again, was a Canadian listed mining company, a Canadian domiciled mining company, which was formed by the prior executive officers of Meridian, the prior Meridian group. So I was a natural to be invited to join the board. Argonaut mined gold from operations in the United States, principally in Mexico. At about the same time, I was approached by a company called Teranga Gold, and also became director of Teranga. Teranga produced gold from mines in West Africa, Senegal.
Okay.
A fascinating country. And I have to say that through both my consulting career and my career as a director, I've just had the opportunity to visit so many wonderful places in the world, and places where not a lot of people have been. Mines tend to be in isolated areas. Senegal really was one of my favorites. The people, it is one of the poorest countries in the world. The people live in little villages and essentially in thatched huts with no
Okay.
electricity. Water is provided by wells that are often contaminated.
Oh,
And yet, these are poor people, but they are happy people. They are happy people. And it was just it was a wonderful experience being a director of Traeger. I have now retired as a director of Traeger and as a director of Iron Gold. I remained a director of a small exploration company called Spanish Mountain Gold, which has
okay.
a large but low-grade gold deposit in central British Columbia, which is now at the stage of having produced a positive preliminary feasibility study. So it's and that, of course, being an exploration company, you have no source of revenue.
Yeah,
And we had to go out to the public and issue shares and raise it. So it's a totally different atmosphere from being a director of
okay.
a company that produces gold and has income.
Exactly.
So I'm still a director of Spanish Mountain.
Okay, okay. So going a little bit back when you said that you have the opportunity to travel a lot around the world to places that usually you don't go to, what is, you can remember the most memorable trip you have done in your consultancy career?
The most memorable. I suppose for two reasons, it would be one of the trips I had back to Australia as a consultant. And this was an assignment for a company, a foreign company,
Yeah,
that was wanting to list on either a North American or European exchange. And it had gold properties in Western Australia. And we were retained, MICON was retained to compile the competent persons report in support of the listing on whatever exchange they chose. It gave me, I went over a week or two early, had spent time with my parents and my two sisters and their families.
okay.
And then we spent a couple of weeks in Western Australia. Western Australia is huge. It's nearly 1 million square miles in area and has very few people. Most of it is desert that's relatively inhabited, relatively uninhabited. So that the population is very spread out and is concentrated in Perth. It was a very entertaining time traveling now to 4 properties in different parts of Western Australia, looking at, and they were mining mainly nickel. When I grew up in Australia, it was known that nickel didn't occur in Australia, it only occurred in Canada. After that, however, rich deposits were discovered in Western Australia and are being mined today. But that was just a fascinating trip. It was to the company where I was born and where I grew up, but it was to a totally different part of that country, which to me was a new world. And that, I think, was probably the best and most entertaining and interesting trip that I've taken. But Alan, there have been so many others to so many different places.
Yes, okay.
Including Poland. Poland was another one.
Do you have a count of how many countries you have visited, roughly?
I've certainly visited every continent except Antarctica.
Okay.
I think I don't know how many countries I visited, but it has to be somewhere north of 50 and probably south of 100, just about the best guess.
Okay.
And in all different cultures. And
yeah, that's what.
It's so fascinating. It's a true. I will say to you, as I have said to my colleagues in the past, the beauty of being in consulting practice is that people pay you to learn new things.
Yes, that's amazing. Yeah,
and I still learn new things when I go on assignments. Not that I travel all that much anymore.
Yes, I agree with you. That's what is very exciting about consultancy. Every time is a new project and you learn something new. Yes, that's true. Now, speaking of consultancy, could you tell us something about these three principles that MICON always is the foundation of MICON: integrity, competence, independence. Was this something that came before MICON, or who came out with those principles?
It was never talked about within the Robertson organization, but those three principles were adhered to: of integrity, independence, and competence, and I put them in that order.
Okay.
And when we joined, when we formed MICON, I guess I was the one that sort of formalized those three words as these are our founding principles. It's imperative. A consultant is an independent advisor.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the mining industry through history has had more than its share of scams and crookedness.
Yes.
For a consultant, without question in my mind, the prime requirement is personal integrity.
Yeah.
The others, of course, independence is required of a consultant, but you can teach independence. And competence is also required, obviously.
Obviously, yeah.
Competence you can buy. Integrity, I think, is something that is either born in you or you learn at a very early age.
Yeah.
It has to be stressed, I think, in any consulting organization.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when there is so much value in, basically a consultant decides or investors trust in what consultants advise. So yeah, integrity is very fundamental.
That indeed is true. And it's particularly important now in that the main codes, the main mining codes, and how you go about your business, are the Australasian Code, which was the first, and then the Canadian NI 43101 code. Unfortunately, both of those were born out of fraud that occurred first in Australia and then another case in Canada. But now there are very strong codes. And if we go to the Canadian code, there's National Instrument 43101, which governs the manner in which mining and exploration companies in Canada can publish can disseminate scientific mining information to the public. And typically, what is required is a report, formally called a technical report, that must be compiled by an independent consultant or group of independent consultants. And that is a report that has a defined table of contents, and every item in that table of contents must be addressed. And those reports are listed on a website set up by the Canadian securities regulators. They are available to the public, and in essence, they are documents that the public is entitled to rely on.
Right. So your main field of expertise is valuation of mineral properties, and I read that you were part of the committee in the CIM BAL standards and guides. So what can you tell us about that? Was that the first developed, or it was?
It was either late in the 1990s or early in the 2000s. Well, what was set up initially after the REACT scandal, which started all this regulatory process of what should we do, the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Ontario Securities Commission jointly set up a task force of technical people, a task force of financial people, a task force of analysts in the mining industry, and a task force of major investors. There are, I think, 15 or so members. MICON was fortunate enough to be appointed as the technical advisor to that task force. So I attended, a lot of it was done by our principal geologist, Kenneth Grace, but I attended several of those meetings. Out of that came ultimately 43101, and out of it also came a desire to set guidelines and standards for how one values a mineral property. And for that, the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy set up a select committee to study the matter and to report upon recommend standards and guidelines for the valuation of mineral property. I was part of that committee that produced those guidelines. I am no longer a member of it. It still exists and occasionally updates the guidelines. I was a member of the committee, certainly up until the original guidelines were formulated and promulgated.
Okay. Yeah, I read that the latest one was reviewed in 2019. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yes.
Things change.
Yes. Yes. It has to be updated. Yeah.
All codes and regulations have to be updated to conform to modern practices as modern practice advances.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, in your fields of expertise, which one is the most that you enjoy the most? In valuation or reviewing feasibility studies?
I suppose most of my work is in the valuation of mineral properties and in the writing or review of feasibility studies, preliminary feasibility studies, and even earlier preliminary economic assessments. I think obviously I enjoy them all. And I think the other thing I do, I suppose that I should say, is expert witness services.
Okay.
And that, although it is stressful, there is always a lawyer who cross-examines you, and his objective is to destroy your credibility, and some of them are very, very good at it. But it's also a mental challenge. You must tell the truth. You must tell the truth.
Yeah.
But I suppose there are different ways of expressing the truth. And in a sense, I enjoy the expert witness work.
Okay.
It's a mental challenge. It's a mental challenge.
Yeah.
More than valuation and feasibility studies.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe I enjoy it.
All right. So, yeah, as you said, you're still active until this day, and so you're taking new jobs, and I mean everyone will have such a privilege to have you as a signing QP in all this valuation reports that you can make, and I want to just recognize that you have a very talented writing skills. When you write, is you cannot stop reading. Your summaries are amazing.
These days, Alan, I probably do very little original technical work, but I do a lot as part of MICON's quality control system. Generally, draft reports are peer reviewed by someone who has not been associated with the project before they are issued, and I do quite a lot of that.
Yes.
And of course, I guess I've been around the block a couple of times and I've written a hell of a lot of reports, so I should be able to write by now.
All right. So, well, you almost be coming to an end. Would you say, a piece of advice to every mining professional that are coming into the industry, or in general? What do you advise to mining engineers?
I think it's difficult, Alan, I think, because when I graduated in the mid-1950s, mining was an honorable profession.
Yeah.
Now it is, and I have to tell you that during the course I did from 1955 to 59 in mining engineering, environmental science was never mentioned.
Okay.
Okay, and that, I think, has been the downfall of the mining industry. It is now regarded as an industry that tends to pollute. And that is true, although huge, huge, huge strides have been made. And the other side of the coin is that just about everything we use has been mined at some point in time. What would I advise somebody going into mining? I would advise them first, I think, certainly to take a job at a mine, take a job involved with an actual mining operation, get your hands dirty, before you go and take ultimately a job in an office. There are several paths. You can, in the mining industry, you can join a mining company as a junior mining engineer, work at one of its mines, gradually work up into head office, and gradually work your way up to be the president. That is one path. Or you can change companies and gradually work your way up to be the president of something else. Other paths are just to stay as a consultant. That, to me, it's the preferred path. As I said, you keep learning new things. Mining, however, it's a vital profession. Things we use, everything we use, generally has been mined.
Exactly.
So it's an important profession. It's one of the few primary industries of which all else depends. I would certainly advise people to go into mining, but I would advise them again, certainly to pay considerable attention to the fragility of our own environment and our own planet.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
I should mention as a plug for Teranga. Teranga, the company that mined gold in Senegal, no longer exists. It was purchased by another company. But during its existence, it won awards for its environmental and social responsibility programs in this area, where people were very poor and needed help. We were able to do quite a lot, really, at very limited expense. And social and environmental programs are imperative within the mining industry.
Yes. Now, I can sense that the mining industry has a big challenge nowadays. I mean, to be sustainable and to take care of the environment, have a environmentally friendly, and get the metals and minerals that we need to thrive our civilization. And there are a lot of challenges especially for this demand of renewable energy, for example. All these specialty metals that before were not even mentioned, right? Like the traditional precious metals or base metals. Now the specialty metals are kicking into a big demand for the future.
Yes.
Yes. All right, Chris. Is there anything else you would like to say or share with us before we say goodbye?
I think, Alan, other than to say that I find that through no virtue of my own, I have been granted a long and privileged life, and I am eternally thankful for that.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Lattanzi.
Thank you, Alan.
It was a pleasure to have you here.
It was good to be with you. Thank you.
Okay. Have a nice day.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Lattanzi for you. And so if you want to contact Mr. Lattanzi, he's available in MICON offices in Toronto. The information will be posted down in the description of this video. And thank you very much for watching.